Welcome to HP at Church, a podcast about Harry Potter and the Bible. I'm Pastor Emily, and I use pronouns like they, them, their.
And I'm Pastor Kay, and my pronouns are she, her.
In this episode, we'll discuss the 9th through 11th Sundays after Pentecost.
If you want to follow along on our blog, it's hpatchurch.wordpress.com, hpatchurch.wordpress.com. And you can find links to the Bible passages we're using and more information on other references we make in the episode.
We begin with the 9th Sunday after Pentecost, which is also known as Proper 14, which is also known as Lectionary 19, which falls on August 11th this year. The first reading is from Genesis chapter 15, verses 1 through 6. Abram and Sarai are promised a biological heir by God, despite their age, and that their descendants will outnumber the stars. Abram's faith leads God to call him righteous. So one of the obvious themes in this passage is the theme of descendants. We hear, especially when it comes to Abraham and Sarah, or Abram and Sarai, as they are so called in this passage, we hear a lot about descendants, and that'll come back up a couple times in this episode, but it's funny because when I think about it, Abram's descendants are going to be infinite, right? As many as the stars in the heavens, and another place we hear as many as the grains of sand scattered along the beach. And yet, in the magical world, it's the exact opposite. The descendants are actually shrinking and getting fewer and fewer, at least as far as pure blood families go. Their blood purity is increasingly scarce, where the bloodlines are dying out, whether it's the Crouches or the Blacks or whatever the case may be.
And if you want examples from the real world too, there are plenty of indigenous groups that are going through the same troubles. Hawaiian people and Native American people and so on.
Mm-hmm. Those are for slightly different reasons, right?
Yes, absolutely.
We're
not really
colonization.
The concept of why the pure blood families have so few children is never really explained. But
I think it's because they self-restrict on who they're right. That's what it is. They talk about it some in the books where it's well, if pure blood families hadn't intermarried with Muggles, we would have died out forever ago.
Yeah.
Versus for indigenous people, it's because colonizers have come in and
they've been genocided.
Yeah. Committed genocide. So in verse 1, we hear from God, "Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield." And my immediate thought went to Harry's invisibility cloak, which is actually a functional shield for him. Unlike other invisibility cloaks, his actually you can't cast spells that will hit it or damage it, versus other invisibility cloaks that aren't of quite the same quality. They can fade, they can get damaged by spells, but his is just this strong shield that will protect him.
Yeah. And when I read that passage of God being Abram's shield, the first thing that came to mind for me was that I hadn't really thought about it before, but it's interesting that none of the houses have a shield as their physical symbol in the world. Gryffindor has a sword, and I would kind of expect one of the other houses to have a shield to kind of go with that, But instead, Ravenclaw has a diadem, Hufflepuff has a cup, Slytherin has a locket. I would have expected, if any of the three of them were to have a shield, I guess I would have expected Hufflepuff to have it. It's not really a Ravenclaw thing, and Gryffindor and Slytherin being paired would be kind of weird, but...
Yeah, it could be a Slytherin thing, I think. But also, the symbols, those symbols that you're talking about they're not symbols of the houses so much as the founders of the houses.
Yeah.
And so then it makes sense.
Although I've always thought of Helga Hufflepuff as being kind of a shield herself, because she's the one who welcomes everyone else. Everyone who wouldn't be... she kind of acts as a shield for them.
It's like an umbrella.
Yes, I suppose.
And I thought you were going to talk about the shields of the houses, because each house does have a shield, and there's a shield for all of Hogwarts, right? But it's
Oh,
not
right.
the like physical one, it's the like emblem of the house.
Yes, the oh, I used to know what they're actually called.
Aren't
The
they called
heraldry.
shields?
Well,
Oh wow.
yeah, it depends on the form of like what the background shape is to the heraldry. There's like if it's a diamond shape, that's called a lozenge, and stuff like
A
that. It's
lozenge, like what I have when I have a sore throat.
yes, because there's a long story. Anyway, the British and European traditions around heraldry get really bizarre and very specific, and this is what you learn about if you go to Ren fairs a lot. But so there are different words for that. So I guess I hadn't really thought of them as shields because I was thinking of them
because you know the fancy terms.
Well, I used to know, and I have now apparently forgotten. So
yeah. Interesting.
Mm-hmm. And then, like, if your symbol actually has the motto attached to it, like the motto is supposed to be a part of it, then there's one word for that versus one that doesn't have words that are actually attached to it, that kind of thing. So, well, I've heard them called shields before too. So,
okay,
yeah, you're not totally the only person who has thought of them that way.
In verse 3, Abram is responding to God with some pretty legitimate questions and concerns. And because Abram has not yet had any offspring, and so says, "You have given me no offspring, and so a slave born in my house is to be my heir." And that just struck me as like, we all know that house elves are the like stand-in air quotes, for enslaved peoples.
The whole forced unpaid labor thing being kind of a hint.
Yeah.
Yes.
But like, heaven forbid we should actually acknowledge that there are people who have and still live in that situation.
Yeah.
Anyway, so then I was thinking about if Kreacher had actually inherited the House of Black. Like, in many functional ways he did while Sirius was in Azkaban. Like, he was the only one there, all of that stuff. But it was just like the image of Kreacher as the head of the House of Black, which I think he would love to be. But.
And then in verse 4, God tells Abram, "No one but your own issue shall be your heir." And so clearly this reading is much less fond of the concept of adoption than, say, Paul's writings in the New Testament. Paul uses adoption as a metaphor for our relationship with God all the time. So while adoption itself, as a concept in the world, doesn't always turn out well, see, for example, Harry and the Dursleys, although I've always thought that case was more of a fostering situation.
Yeah.
There are several ways that certain types of relationships between people are perceived differently early on in the Bible versus, say, later on in the New Testament. And so this is one of them that we can see. So change does happen in the Bible, and that's okay. Also, I'm sure that there are historical and cultural reasons that exist and that I could look up, although I did not actually take the time to do so this time. But I did find myself wondering why this guy in particular would be Abraham's heir. Is he the highest ranking in the household? Has he just been with the family the longest? This is another one of those reminders that biblical slavery and the American concepts about slavery are very different in certain respects. Both are still evil, absolutely, and it's a major part of how we read the Bible, that we have to see it through this lens of slavery existing and being seen as an accepted part of how the world works. But this is also a reminder that what your ordinary American person who went through the public school system might think of as slavery is not quite how it worked in the biblical world.
Yeah. That makes sense.
Our second reading for this Sunday is from Hebrews chapter 11, verses 1 through 3 and 8 through 16. The author gives a classic definition of faith and gives examples of what faith looks like, especially the faith of Abraham and Sarah.
So, in case you couldn't tell by the fact that the word came up 3 times in the summary of the passage, a theme in this passage from Hebrews is faith. We don't really get a lot of kind of explicit stuff in the books about faith because nobody in the books tends to be all that interested in religion or spirituality. But we do see faith come up, and I think one of the examples that I keep going back to is how faith comes up for Harry, particularly in Deathly Hallows after Rita's article and book come out about Dumbledore, where all of this stuff that he thought he knew is now called into question, and he has to figure out how much faith to put into Dumbledore. And as with many people, faith sometimes is just this is my only option. I have no other option. I'm at the end of my rope. If I don't do this, I have no idea what I'm going to do.
Yeah.
And that I think certainly comes out with Harry, where like, this is the mission Dumbledore gave me. Like, if I'm not doing this, then I have no guidance whatsoever and no idea how to tackle Voldemort.
Yeah.
So I might as well just like keep doing this one and see where it goes.
I would agree with that. And speaking of that, in verse 1, we get this lovely definition of faith, and we see that there is kind of a difference, I think, between the concepts of faith and the concept of trust. I would say that when I mean, they're similar, but I think there is a distinction between them. Trust I tend to think of as being earned or very occasionally given kind of on a hunch basis. Whereas faith is not, it's not based on previous experience or previous results, you know? It's way, way less logical, to be honest. And we don't see a lot of examples of faith in the Harry Potter books, like you said, but I do see one in fandom, and I might get yelled at for this, but fandom has always, in my experience, been convinced that James and Lily Potter would have been good parents. Would have been, like, extraordinarily awesome parents, in fact.
James might have been horrid.
Well, I'm not saying that either of them would have been horrid. I am saying that they both had some personality flaws, and that could have become an issue in Harry's childhood if they had lived. Being willing to face down Voldemort for your kid is certainly a good sign. I mean, yes, absolutely. But parenting over a lifetime takes a lot more than that. It's much more of a constant and often, frankly, boring grind than one moment of decision in a crisis. And we don't know either James or Lily well enough to know whether or not they would have been great at that. I don't think we'll ever know. Although certainly fandom has given us some examples of what that might have looked like.
And also never underestimate the ability of J.K. Rowling to come up with something from the grave. But
she's not actually dead. Oh, from James and Lily's graves. Okay, that makes more sense. Sorry.
No, it wasn't quite what I was talking about.
Oh, the author being dead was what you... Yes, okay.
Dead and,
but
and I think that there are, like, hints at Lily temperament-wise. I could see Lily being a good parent.
Yeah.
I wouldn't want to parent with James.
I have some issues with James. Lily's relationship with her sister, I don't know that you could put that entirely on Petunia's head. Like, Petunia definitely influenced it, but it takes two to tango, and I kind of wonder what about how Lily treated Petunia led to that.
Well, and I think Lily didn't live into her Gryffindorness at the beginning, right? So it wasn't even necessarily that she did something, but that she didn't do something. She didn't really stop Snape from dropping a branch on Petunia's head.
Yeah, and the whole thing with Snape, instead of trying to be a positive, active force in his life, she just kind of let all that fizzle, and that's... Like, it's totally not her fault that he went to the Death Eaters. That is totally on him, absolutely. But she wasn't a very good friend to him. I don't think. Really?
I think she was a good friend, because she was trying. Like, we get glimpses of her trying to be like, Sev, you're hanging out with a really bad group of people.
Right.
And they're not going to go well and stuff. But ultimately, like, somebody calls me a mudblood, yeah, I'm done. Like,
oh, no, I'm totally on board with
that
too. But like you said, she didn't stop him from dropping the branch on Petunia.
But I think that's also, like, there's this complexity of kids and
sibling relationships and so on.
Sibling relationships and, like, this new discovery of this thing that's true about yourself that you've never known, and this is the only other person that has any, like, knowledge about it.
Yeah.
And then he does this thing, and it's hard to, like, I don't know.
Yeah, no, I can see that being a tangled knot, absolutely. But I
think small seeds were planted, and then they just kind of snowballed in ways that
right.
certain people, particularly Vernon.
And also, I kind of wonder what Lily's parents thought of Snape. And, like, how active were they in keeping an eye on her friendship with this total stranger?
So, in verse 9, I feel like I always bring up them wandering in the wilderness in Deathly Hallows, but it's such a common thing in the Bible, and it's such a common thing in Deathly Hallows. I don't know.
And it's really just the last couple episodes. Because before that, you were going on and on about Dolores Umbridge and her rules for several episodes. So you have your
my themes.
Your themes, I suppose. But
it's like the
change.
Themes
yes,
kind of carry over from one Sunday to the next.
Uh-huh.
Anyway, in verse 9, the author talks about Abraham and Sarah living as in a foreign land, living in tents, and the trio obviously wander around in the Deathly Hallows. They wander in tents. But then as I was thinking about this, I realized that Harry's time with the Dursleys and his return to the magical world after being with them were both like living in a foreign land for him.
Ooh, yeah.
Right? Because it's
wildly uncomfortable and kind of strange.
And you don't know what's going on, and you're totally disoriented, and you just kind of have to trust that people will not completely take advantage of you.
And he sort of does speak a different language.
Yeah. In verse 13, when we hear that all of these died in faith without having received the promises, I was thinking about the picture that Moody shows Harry. So in the Order of the Phoenix, Moody shows Harry this picture that he found while looking for his spare invisibility cloak.
Because of course he has a spare.
You know, like you do. And it's this photo of the original Order of the Phoenix. And so there's, right, Moody's pointing everybody out, and there's Moody and Dumbledore and Daedalus Diggle. But then very quick, like after those three, Moody's talking about them, and it's Marlene McKinnon, who was killed 2 weeks after this was taken, Frank and Alice Longbottom, Emmeline Vance, who's alive, but then gets killed at the beginning of Half-Blood Prince, Lupin, Benji Fenwick, who also died, Edgar Bones, who died, and then Amelia Bones, who ends up dying at the beginning of Half-Blood Prince. Podmore's there, but then Caradoc Dearborn, Hagrid is there, Elphias Doge is still there, Gideon Pruitt, who died, as well as his brother Fabian, who are also related to Molly. Like, those are her brothers, I think.
Yes. And Fred and George were not quite named after them.
Yeah, but they both had the initials.
Yeah.
And then Aberforth is still alive, but Dorcas Meadows, Sirius is still alive, and then also Harry's parents and Wormtail.
Right.
And so it's just this, like, all of these people who really and truly died in faith, died fighting for a cause that they believed in, and didn't receive the promises. But then also there's this, like, but from a distance they saw and greeted them, right? Like,
right.
The distance of time, through the distance of time, because of this picture, they get to wave at Harry.
Yeah.
Which is kind of cool.
Yeah, this is one of those rare moments when we both read a verse and basically thought the same thing, except I was thinking about Regulus and Sirius and Remus and Tonks, and the folks that we actually get to meet in the books, who never got to see the world that they fought for.
Our gospel reading for this Sunday is Luke chapter 12, verses 32 through 40. Jesus reminds the disciples they have nothing to fear and to remain alert for his return, because where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. As Jesus is talking to the disciples, he is encouraging them to be prepared, right? Be prepared.
Constant vigilance.
I love that I went Lion King and you went Harry Potter. And so I was thinking about the moment particularly in the movies, is where the quote actually comes from, but in Deathly Hallows, after they get out of Gringotts and Harry figures out where the last Horcrux is, and he's like, we have to go to Hogsmeade, we have to get to Hogwarts. And Hermione's like, no, we have to make a plan. and then they're like, we plan, we get there, all hell breaks loose. And it was just this like beautiful, like, even Jesus is like, plan these things, plan for it, get ready, be prepared. And then it's like, yeah, but really, we're gonna pull out Ecclesiastes and just be like, there's nothing. Plan, get there, all hell breaks loose. In verse 33, Jesus encourages folks to sell your possessions and give alms. Make purses for yourselves that do not wear out. Which is basically exactly what Hermione Granger did for their Deathly Hallows adventure. She sold all of her like bonds and all of her stuff so that she would have Muggle money as they were camping. And then she made a purse to end all purses that will not wear out and has undetectable extension charms, and
which is
nice
not
and
exactly what Jesus meant, but
minor detail.
Yes, true. Yeah,
minor detail. Jesus didn't want us to store all of our possessions in a purse. Oh, okay. Sell your possessions, not store them. Gotcha.
Right. Yeah. Also, I think that's an aspect of the story that we tend to forget, that by the end of the war, Hermione's basically broke, and she'll have to work just as hard as Ron to be able to get by as a grown up. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think provided she goes back and fixes her parents and gets them back, like there's a little bit of,
and then gets back on their good side after they freak.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Then there's a little bit of, she has kind of the safety net that comes with the privilege of being the daughter of
dentists.
Yeah.
In verse 34, we hear that where your treasure is, there your heart will be also.
My favorite promise ever in the Bible.
Okay. I guess I didn't grow up thinking of it as a promise as I did sort of a guideline for how to live your life. Because treasure isn't necessarily money. Harry's heart, for example, was never really in Weasley's Wizard Wheezes. I mean, he liked it and all, but despite the fact that he gave them a huge amount of his money, that wasn't where his life was centered. Your treasure in this verse is what you value most. Whatever you put in the center of your life will be where your heart is truly. For example, this is why addiction is so dangerous, and so on. So, and for that matter, why the locket was so dangerous to the trio in Book 7, because one of the things it kept doing was shifting where their treasure was, where their focus and their center was, to more of a selfish and angry place than where it would have been, where they would have been otherwise.
But I think this has more to do with money than you're giving it credit for, though.
I mean, right? Money's definitely an aspect of it, yeah.
It's within the context of sell your possessions and give alms.
Right.
And I haven't always grown up with it as a promise, but particularly when it comes to the Matthew one, we were talking about it in a stewardship class in seminary once. And it was that where your treasure is, there your heart will be also, which is this promise that where you put your treasure, then your heart will follow. So Harry cares more about Weasley's Wizard Wheezes than he would have. Probably. Because he has invested in it.
Especially once he realizes that he gets all his stuff for free. Yeah.
I mean, that too. But he also has an abundance of money, right?
Right.
And hasn't really, like, grasped what that means for his life in a way that other people, or those of us that are adults, might feel differently about the money that we have and how we might spend it, and might not, you know.
And a socialized medical system and so on. Yeah.
Yeah. But there is this, like, where we spend, right, that a budget is a moral document. Where we spend money, where we put money,
sure,
says something about what we value. And that we have a choice, right? If we want to value something more, it's not that you should wait to give more until you value it more, but actually, like, giving more will help you value it more.
Yes.
Which is cool. Because then we get to decide a little bit more where our heart...
Although, if, as a pastor, you try to tell your congregation that if they're worried that they're not taking church seriously enough, they should give the church more money, that one you have to phrase very, very carefully.
True.
Yeah.
In verse 37, we hear, "Truly I tell you, the master will fasten his belt and have the slaves sit down to eat, and he will come and serve them." I just have to say that this is so far from the truth. There is no way that a master is going to get back from a trip late at night, see his slaves still up, and come and make them food and serve it to them.
This is one of the things that draws a distinction between what God is like and what we are like, though, right? Well, like, if God is the master, then...
You would think that, but, like, that's not exactly... Like, that's not how... Jesus doesn't phrase it as, like, there's a comparison or any of that.
That's
it's
true.
Just, like, be like those who are waiting for their master to return from the wedding banquet, so that they may open the door for him as soon as he comes and knocks. Yeah. There's no... This is the role of God. Or the reign of God can be compared to a master who... No. It's just like Jesus being like, and this is what the master would do. And then I can imagine, like, everybody who hears it being like, Jesus?
What?
Have you lived in this world?
It also kind of... I mean, I hope that he's trying to illustrate the ideal. I can totally... Like, there are certain characters in Harry Potter which, if they came home and found out that Dobby was waiting up for them, they would say, "Did you even bother to eat?" And then, immediately try to feed him something.
No, they wouldn't. Nobody would do that. Dumbledore wouldn't do that. And Dumbledore's probably the closest to one being... Like, nobody would do that for Dobby. Harry wouldn't do that for Dobby.
Hermione.
I don't think people care about Dobby that much. I think Dobby cares about them way more than they care about him.
Yeah, that's probably true.
Which is maybe a, like, super controversial opinion, but...
No, I think that's fair. I could see Molly Weasley doing this for someone who, like, worked for her or worked for her husband, but not Dobby, not a house elf. Yeah.
Yeah. Yep. There's that super distinction of class. And in their case, species, right? But...
Yeah. And then in verse 40, we hear that the Son of Man comes at an unexpected hour. And we have this really bad habit on the show of just, it seems like we're constantly comparing Voldemort to Jesus. And no, that's not true. It just feels so weird whenever we do, because it does happen sometimes, because sometimes Harry is not quite as perfect of a Jesus parallel as he is other times.
And I don't think that Harry should be a Jesus parallel.
Yeah, I'm okay with that.
I think things are complicated, and so it makes sense for, like, sometimes Voldemort does things that are surprisingly similar to what Jesus does. Like, Jesus has to be shrewd, and, like, he knows what's up.
Right. So one of the things that Voldemort does that makes him similar to Jesus is that he shows up at an unexpected time, as opposed to Harry, who shows up at Hogwarts right on the dot when he's supposed to be there. But very few people ever expected Voldemort to return at all. And so I ask myself, is being ready for evil to arrive at an unexpected time, much like being ready for Jesus to arrive at an unexpected time? And I kind of think they are very similar, if not exactly identical.
I like that. I think, though, also that it's easier to predict when evil will show up. Because I think evil shows up
much more often.
Most consistently, it's possible to predict evil showing up when something really good is happening, when justice is being done, when we're making progress, when we're working towards justice. I think evil is most likely to show up to try to resist that.
Yeah.
It's my theory, anyway. My headcanon about evil.
Yeah, that sounds fair. Our second Sunday for this episode is the 10th Sunday after Pentecost, also known as Proper 15, also known as Lectionary 20, and it falls this year on the 18th of August. And our first reading is from Jeremiah, chapter 23, verses 23 through 29. Jeremiah, called to speak God's truth instead of what people want to hear, reminds the people that God's word is far more powerful than any false prophet.
So one theme on this that I noticed was an intimacy with God. Like, it really feels like God being near and being acquainted with dreams and that sort of thing really feels intimate to me in the way that Jeremiah talks about God. And then I was like, intimacy in the Harry Potter books. None. Right? And we don't really get them because Harry is the #unreliable narrator. And,
and I'm okay with that
old.
Because he's also, 17 when the books end, and there are some things I really don't need to read as a grown-up.
But we do get a glimpse of it that Harry even tries not to notice when the secret question for the Weasley parents is when they're doing their secret questions to make sure neither of them are Death Eaters at the beginning of Half-Blood Prince, and Arthur has told Molly his answer, and then he asks her what she likes him to call her when they're alone, and Molly is like, turns bright red. Harry also turns bright red and starts to eat as loud as he can, while Molly mumbles to the door, "Molly wobbles." And it's just this, like, there's
things I didn't need to know, number 573.
I will count that, like, that's not a, cutesy name for Molly that I've ever heard or thought. But there's also just this beautiful intimacy between them in this, like, whispering through the doors, but also in, like, having those names and knowing so deeply that the only two of them that know that are the two of them. As we move into the verses, verse 25, we hear, "The prophets have said, I have dreamed, I have dreamed." And it just, like, the image in my head was Trelawney in class being like, "I have seen this, I have seen it, I have seen it, this is going to happen, the Grim, Harry the Grim," or whatever the case may be. But, like, just this, like, fantastical proclamation of, like, "I've done it, I have it," but, like, slightly ethereal and, like, dreamy, and
and the hair and the glasses and the general, waving around of the arms. Yeah.
Naturally, I was doing the waving around of the arms. And
yes, I was very impressed.
Thank you.
In verse 26, we hear the word prophesy, and that's not a word that comes up a lot in the English language. So I just wanted to mention that prophesy, with the S in it, and the long I sound at the end, is the verb form of prophecy. A prophecy is something that's told to you about the future, or in the Bible, it's someone telling you about God's will. An example of a prophecy from the Harry Potter books would be the prophecy that Harry would defeat Voldemort, and that prophecy was prophesied by Sybil Trelawney. A prophet might prophesy prophecy, or maybe many prophecies, but the Daily Prophet, however, only prophesies lies by saying that Voldemort isn't back. So I hope you find that helpful.
And you get a special shout out if any of you can say those two sentences. A prophet prophesies prophecy, or maybe many prophecies. The Daily Prophet, however, prophesies lies by saying Voldemort isn't back. If any of you can say that 5 times at a clip, you don't have to do it super fast, but you cannot do it slowly, and record it and send it to us, we will give you a special shout out. And if you want us to, we will include it in the next podcast.
I'm just saying, having been in choir for most of my childhood and adolescence comes in handy at the weirdest times.
Like just then.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Well, and then we get the verse 28 with, let the prophet who has a dream tell the dream, with the implication that the dream is not true. It's not an actual prophecy.
Or it might have been a real dream, but it was just a dream.
Yeah. And then I was thinking, of course, of Harry's dreams, which are actually real. Yes. And true and factual, except for the one about Sirius. But that's
awkward
because of the awkwardness of Voldemort. But for the most part, Harry's dreams are super real. And the one time that he really, really acts on the dream is, of course, the one time that it's not actually real.
And I would hope that Harry also got to just have normal dreams. We
catch glimpses of it. Mostly when they're fading into the, creepy dreams. Yeah. There's one where he's, playing Quidditch, I think.
Or we get to overhear Ron have some fun ones here and there, too, I think, in the books.
Not the spiders! Not the spiders!
Poor Ron. And then in verse 29, God says, is not my word like fire? When Jewish people talk about reading God's word, one of the images that they'll use to talk about God's word is calling it black fire on white fire. It's really just black ink on white paper, but the ideas behind it are like fire. Mm. Much like how a Bible in Christian tradition, the Bible itself isn't valued because it's some kind of magical object that has to be valued or it will hurt you. I mean, it's not a talisman. It's not. A Bible is really just a book, except for the ideas in it, and it's the ideas in it that we value. Compare that, for example, to, say, the Monster Book of Monsters in Harry Potter, which you really do have to treat carefully or else you will get snapped at. So.
That is true.
But I do love the image of God's word as black fire on white fire. That's just beautiful to me.
Yeah, that is cool. Our second reading for this Sunday is Hebrews chapter 11, verse 29 through chapter 12, verse 2. The author of Hebrews gives many further biblical examples of faithful people, reminding us that we are not alone, and that the stories of the great cloud of witnesses can guide us in our faith. So a theme in this passage is the stories of our ancestors. So in the Hebrews passage, we get a lot of different references to stories. We don't get the whole story, but they're meant to evoke the stories that we should ideally know, or maybe might want to go look up. And so I know I ask my mom for stories about family members, particularly those who have died, on the anniversary of their death or their birthday or anniversaries or that sort of thing.
Sure.
And I just was hit with this sorrow for Harry, because he gets some of the stories of his parents once he gets to school, but he doesn't get the stories of all his ancestors. It doesn't seem like the Dursleys really talk about Petunia's parents, and that's only one generation, let alone the many generations back. There's this huge gap, right, between the stories that Harry hears about Lily and James, and then the story of the Peverell brothers.
Right.
Despite being technically, they're the ancestors, but, so many generations back. And
yeah, I kind of wonder if he ever gets to look up somebody who knew his Potter grandparents.
That would be cool.
Yeah. after the war, maybe.
Yeah. No, I wonder if he ever looks up Lily's parents, like to try to find out if there's any sort of extended family that he's connected to. Because Dumbledore didn't look that hard.
No.
He did not put in the effort he needed to. There were no background checks on those families.
Yeah. If ever there was a story that encouraged people to have a really thorough will that included all possibilities, that would be one of them. So.
If we should die and the only way to protect my child is by some blood relative, these are all the relatives that are acceptable in the order of preference.
In verse 31, one of the people who's listed as an example of faithful witness is Rahab. And in ancient Israel, as a foreign sex worker who betrayed her own people, she would have been about as far down the respectability ladder as it's possible to get.
Although technically Israel was the foreigners then, because they were about to invade the land.
Well, yes, she was foreign to Israel, so in Israel she would have been a foreigner.
Yeah.
Yes. Within the people of Israel, not within the country of Israel, which didn't actually, wasn't actually a thing yet.
Yeah.
And yet, she becomes a heroic character in the Bible for what she did, and she ends up marrying into the people of Israel and becoming an ancestor of Jesus, listed in his genealogy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I love
and if there's a character who reminds me of Rahab somewhere in the Harry Potter books, in some, although certainly not all aspects, I would say Dobby, who is disrespected as a house elf and who betrays the Malfoys for the Order, or, if you want to be more realistic, who betrays the Malfoys for Harry and Dumbledore, and a little bit for himself, and who dies a hero of the Order for it. I mean, the Order might not be taking much notice right that second, but you can bet that Harry will make sure they do.
Oh yeah, if Harry made sure that Severus Snape's portrait got in the the head office, that there's like some the new Fountain of Magical Brethren.
I had a feeling this would be coming up somewhere around here.
Oh my gosh, can you imagine a Fountain of Magical Brethren that like lifts up Dobby as at the top, but like all of the people who were killed and all of the beings who were killed, but like having Dobby at the top and like the wizards are the lowest and the witches are a little bit above and the witches and
Sure.
That's what I think the Fountain of Magical Brethren would be like. Today, at least.
Yes. And I find this interesting not just because of the lack of respect that we have for these people, but both Dobby and Rahab become heroes through betrayal, when you think about it. I mean, they both basically... They are traitors. There's no really other way to put it. You really can't.
Mm-hmm.
But as far as we can tell with Rahab, much like Dobby, she's betraying people who never really treated her that well in the first place.
Well, we don't know that for sure.
Well, given the job she ended up in.
Well, so being a sex worker is not necessarily a terrible thing. In that time and that culture, like, she knew everybody. She was a resource, a really good resource. So I don't know that she was really treated poorly.
But she doesn't talk about the people in the town well. It's not like she's...
Does she talk about them at all?
She has no second guesses that we see. She does not question her actions. If she betrays them that easily, how dear to her could they possibly be,
That's true. I just want us not to assume that because of her profession, she was treated poorly. That's the piece that I really don't want to
given the fact that the Israelites basically wiped these people off the map, we actually have no idea really what their culture was, except for some very basic archaeological finds, as far as I'm aware.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't know what her status in the city would have been, but Our current culture has some things to say about traitors that don't really lead to them becoming heroes. And so I think it's interesting that we do have these two characters, one in the Bible and one in Harry Potter, who you really can't, I mean, much like Snape, actually. Snape is one too. There are times when that can become heroic, but who would call them a hero depends on which side of the conflict you're on. So, because it's not like Rahab was a hero to the people of her own city.
Yeah.
So there are always moral nuances to these things, if you look for them.
Speaking of moral nuances, I don't think there are very many moral nuances in the description of people going about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, persecuted, tormented, as is described in verse 37. That is just like a picture of people whose lives are awful right now.
Yeah.
And that made me think of the Muggleborns in Deathly Hallows, particularly when the trio are going to Gringotts and they see people begging and saying, I don't have a wand, I can do magic, I'm a witch, I'm a wizard, I'm a witch. Right, like they're trying desperately to hold their identity, and while they are being told that they're worthless and that they're worth less and worthless, and that they are worth being persecuted, that they don't deserve to be alive, to have magic, to have a wand, any of those things. So sad. And then in verse 38, when we hear that they wandered in deserts and mountains and in caves and holes in the ground, and then it made me think of Sirius and Hagrid/Grop, who both used the caves around Hogsmeade for hiding. And for Sirius, it's certainly not ideal, and for Hagrid, probably not either. But for Grop, I wonder if that was also a little bit of home, because he used to live in caves and then was brought to the forest, and then he gets to go back to living in a cave, which is this kind of beautiful thing, even if it's for, less than ideal reasons.
Yeah. Handy that Hogwarts was in Scotland, and so they had access to all those caves.
Yep.
And then in the first verse of the next chapter, we hear, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses.
I love that quote.
Yes. Often it's because we know stories about people who have done incredible things that we come to believe that we can do great things too, even if those stories are fictional, which makes me ask two questions. One, did the Dursleys just avoid reading any fairy tales whatsoever to Dudley in order to avoid the horrible irony, since so many of those are about the people who are cruel to children and getting punished for it? I don't think most of those stories would have gone over all that well if Harry overheard. And two, how would the Harry Potter story have been different if there had been no first Voldemort and his parents had died some other way? If Harry had gone into fighting Voldemort without the history of the first Voldemort to back him up, would Harry have believed he could defeat Voldemort without all those stories of the first Voldemort?
Well, those are really great questions. I definitely think the Dursleys would not have read any fairy tales, but I think they wouldn't have read fairy tales because it would have used magic.
Oh, true.
That was where I thought you were going with that, and then you went a totally different place, and I was like, oh, that too.
Yes. So many reasons. That's totally reasonable.
Right. Yeah, I don't
Which means that Dudley probably also never heard, like, Beatrix Potter or anything, because talking animals. And actually, that kind of explains a lot about Dudley, doesn't it?
Right? Like, he never got stories growing up because imagination was terrible.
Yeah.
And for the second questions, that's such a good wondering for how, like, what is the impact of the stories we tell?
Yeah.
And the stories we hear.
I mean, I've spoken to people who grew up as, frankly, abused children, and it was fairy tales that gave them hope, because in the fairy tales, there's a famous quote by G.K. Chesterton that fairy tales don't tell us that the monsters are real. We already know that. Fairy tales tell us that the monsters can be killed. And I love that.
Yeah.
And so stories can give us hope in amazing ways.
Yeah, that's true.
Our gospel reading for this Sunday is from Luke chapter 12, verses 49 through 56. Jesus reminds the disciples that the power of God's word can divide people and families, and that the road that they face will not be easy.
So a theme that came up for me in this passage was divisiveness. Jesus says that he will be divisive, and I think I have complicated feelings about divisiveness because frequently those who are more marginalized and those who are working for justice are told that we're the divisive ones.
Yeah.
Or that we're causing division, when in reality the division was already there. We're just bringing it out into the open.
Yeah.
And forcing people to confront and acknowledge it. And I think that that's what Jesus is doing, right? He's not letting people hide behind the Roman Empire or the structures as they exist and pretend like everything's fine. And that's also what Harry did in Order of the Phoenix, right? He was very divisive because he was insistent that Voldemort was back and that people needed to be doing something that they weren't doing, and that Umbridge was a terrible, horrible person.
Yeah. Absolutely. In verse 49, we hear Jesus say that he came to bring fire to the earth. But this verse reads a lot differently if you hear that bit from Jeremiah that we heard a couple readings ago, and also the bit about the fire in the Hebrews reading.
Mm-hmm.
Because it calls God's word fire. Jesus is God's word, right? The truth is that the world and the life that Jesus describes for us, the world that God's word describes for us, is remarkably different from the one we actually live in. And it's filled with things like far more grace and generosity and justice and so on than we're really comfortable with. And this goes back to the idea that there are people and there are times when all of us are a little uncomfortable with the idea of being quite that gracious, being quite that generous. It just isn't what we're used to.
And it's hard.
And yes, and all those ideas can and have divided families, much like how families became divided during the Volda Wars. Not necessarily because one person was a Death Eater and one person was in the Order, but for much more specific...
Although for the House of Black, that was
well, yes, sometimes. But there were also more individual reasons, more reasons that were a little bit more nuanced. Like with the Weasleys and Percy, Percy's demeanor had a lot more to do with it than where Percy fell on the political spectrum.
Yeah, that's actually where...
And he's not that old yet, and he's not a child, but he's not entirely formed as a person yet, I would say.
Yeah.
And so expecting people to go through an awkward phase, it's not that different from your cousin going through that, libertarian phase when they're in their early 20s. And many of us have lived through family members doing something like that and then coming back around after a few years once they realize what's going on. So.
Yeah, I was actually thinking about the Weasleys for verse 52, when Jesus gets a bit more specific on, from now on, 5 in one household will be divided, and thinking about the Weasleys and the way that they were divided. And it was, right, it was because of Percy and his personality and the way that he was approaching things and thinking about things and the way that he valued authority differently than the rest of the Weasleys. But then also, like, the House of Black, so, like, Sirius and Regulus obviously are the example of, Death Eater and member of the Order. But even further back, the House of Black was split, right, with Sirius's cousins, Andromeda and Narcissa and Bellatrix, where Andromeda was the one who pulled away. And I think if I remember correctly, the, like, whole history of the House of Black is, like, filled with different people pulling away from the pureblood rigidity of that house at different points. Sirius's
I believe
uncle is
that
the
the
one who
comment...
died and left the apartment to Sirius, and
Yeah. I believe I remember that comment about the family tree on the wall at 12 Grimald Place, and how there were actually several names that had been smudged out.
Blasted out with a wand. Yeah. On verse 52, when Jesus says, "You know how to interpret the appearance of earth and sky." And Jesus was talking about, like, you know when a storm is coming and when it's going to be hot and stuff, but, like, my mind immediately went to, is there a branch of divination for the sky in general or just for the stars? It seems like maybe the centaurs kind of do this, but, like, is there a thing of cloud reading? We do that as muggles all the time, and we see animals and
it's a bunny rabbit,
right? But I wonder if there's something like that for divination.
Yeah, we never see that in the Harry Potter books. I know that there are magical traditions in the world that have done some types of cloud reading, some more specific than others, but I'm not sure about in Harry Potter.
Mm-hmm.
And this is another example of us looking at the same verse and thinking totally different things, because my reaction to this, to Jesus saying, "You know how to interpret the earth and the sky, but not the present time," was, maybe that's because you're so freaking cryptic, Jesus. If you'd be a little less like Dumbledore and a little more like Remus, then we'd be able to interpret this stuff better, wouldn't we? Thanks. So.
That's hilarious.
I might have been a little irritated.
You know, just a little. Jesus can be irritating sometimes. It's part of his divisiveness. Part of, him being both spot on and cryptic.
Yeah.
Our final Sunday for this episode is the 11th Sunday after Pentecost, also known as Proper 16, also known as Lectionary 21, which falls on August 25th this year. The first reading for this Sunday is from Isaiah chapter 58, verses 9b through 14. The prophet Isaiah reminds us that God is always with us. When we focus on helping those in need, we will be recognized for our work of restoration. And the Sabbath is God's gift to us, reminding us of our need to not focus solely on ourselves. So a theme that I noticed in this passage were small mercies and relief from injustice, right? Isaiah is talking about removing the yoke from among you, but the examples that Isaiah is giving are really small interpersonal ones, right? Of not pointing the finger, speaking evil, offering food to the hungry, and satisfying the needs of the afflicted. But these small little ways of resisting all of the ways that we're tempted to perpetuate or at least allow injustice to continue. And so then I was thinking about when that comes up in Hogwarts, and I feel like I come back to the Hogwarts of the Deathly Hallows Hogwarts before the battle a lot, but I really love that model that we just get a glimpse of when Neville and everybody are like telling the trio what they've been up to, right? But Neville tells them about like getting crucioed for mouthing off, and they're like, "What? Why would you do that?" And then it's like, well, it's because it helps us all resist, because seeing other people and witnessing other people, even in small forms of resistance, makes it easier for the rest of us to also resist.
Yeah.
Which is cool.
In verses 9 and 10, we hear that if you stop, to paraphrase verses 9 and 10, if you stop blaming each other and speaking evil, and if you help those in need, even your gloomiest will look like noonday sun to others, sort of. I would say, yeah, I agree with this. I've seen it happen. It is remarkable how easy it is for a congregation to get a good reputation in a community if they help people and they aren't visibly jerks. There's really no other way to put it. It's remarkable how fast that can happen.
Mm-hmm. And not just the pastor helping people, right? But like
no, the whole congregation, like as a group. Like all you really have to do is is be consistent and be there and help people, and don't visibly be jerks about it, or to each other while you're doing it. And boom, you become a really powerful force in the community for good. It's not that hard. And yet it really seems like it is that hard sometimes.
I mean, if I had to not be a jerk and get along with somebody I really didn't like, it might be a little hard.
It does take some effort in that rate, but it's amazing how much less work the helping people part is, and how much more work the not being a jerk part is.
True.
So, yeah. But imagine if we apply this to Harry Potter, imagine how many people that the magical world could have helped, and what even the Muggle world could have been like if the magical world stopped having wars between itself because of, frankly stupid stuff like blood purity, and instead started actually trying to help people. The enormous difference in what the world could look like for everyone if that was their goal, instead of focusing on things like are the purebloods having enough children. It's amazing what they could have done.
Yeah, there's so much good that you could do with that kind of power if you turned it towards compassion and mercy.
Yeah.
And justice. When I was thinking about verse 12, I was thinking, so we hear, your ancient ruins shall be rebuilt. You shall raise up the foundations of many generations. You shall be called the repairer of the breach, the restorer of streets to live in. And it's just this beautiful call to live into what could be, and the ways that they could be a people of restoration, a people who rebuild. And that is also the call for the community after the second World War, right? Is to raise up the foundations of many generations, literally raise up the foundations of Hogwarts and rebuild those foundations for the future generations.
Yeah.
And repair the breach between Muggles and Muggleborns and the magical world. Restore the streets that have been damaged.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful vision.
And many of my favorite fanfiction stories are actually centered in that time, in the Reconstruction.
Yeah, I was talking to my housemate, and they were asking me if I think there was an 8th year, if Harry and Ron went back, and I was like, well, canon says this, but I don't know. I don't know that they would have or not, but...
Hermione would have.
Well, we know Hermione did,
yes.
And for sure would have, whether or not we knew it. But Harry and Ron are a little bit... They both should have.
Yeah.
But whether they do or not. But the 8th year fanfic is one of their favorites as well, and I have never really gotten into it very much, and so that's on my list. I
don't know that the 8th year fanfic are the ones that I've read a few of them, but they're not really my favorites. But the ones where it's after that, and the trio are out living in the world and helping with the Reconstruction, or other characters are out living in the world and helping with the Reconstruction. I really like those.
Okay, gotcha. In verse 13, we kind of get this shift in focus, and Isaiah starts talking about Sabbath and the importance of Sabbath and respecting and honoring the Sabbath. And then I was thinking about it, and I was like, I don't know if there is a Sabbath in the magical world, or what Sabbath would be for the magical world. There's certainly times of rest, right? When you go home for summer break in particular, there's a Sabbath.
We've talked about that before. Sure.
But
except for Harry.
But there is even for Harry once he's away from the Dursleys.
Yeah. Well, I think also if you're going to ask that question, we have to define what Sabbath is, because I would say that this passage gives a slightly different definition of Sabbath than what we're used to. I looked at these verses and I said to myself, so often when we talk about Sabbath, we talk solely about rest. And believe me, hey, rest is good. I'm on board with that. We were talking about the nap ministry in the last episode, stuff like that. But here, it's also recast as a day to honor God, and one way to honor God is helping others. in this passage. I'm totally in favor of the trio fighting Voldemort, don't get me wrong, but Harry's also not entirely doing it out of altruism. He's also trying not to die. I'm in favor of Harry not dying, but it's not like he's doing this purely to help others.
Mm-hmm.
Ron and Hermione are both also in favor of Voldemort losing, but they are partially, at least, in it to help their friend, Harry.
Mm-hmm.
And if Sabbath is cast as a day to put aside your own interests entirely and to help others and rest and focus on God's interests, do we see the trio putting aside their own interests entirely very often in the books?
Hermione,
and
yes.
Would that be a Sabbath?
Hermione, yes, all the time. And it's not Sabbath because she's being manipulated and taken advantage of to do other people's homework.
Is that her putting aside her own interests? Because when she does that, she maintains her friendships, which she hasn't really had before.
Oh my gosh, we're going to get into the Friends episode that we're not going to link to because Friends has not aged well.
No.
Where Joey and Phoebe are like arguing about whether there is any truly altruistic act of charity, or like that if you could ever actually do something for someone else without it being selfish.
You know, I don't think I remember that one, and I've seen a lot of Friends. Okay.
I've seen them all, so.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's a really interesting conversation that they have, but I feel like that's what kind of the game that we're playing with this, right? Is like, if Sabbath has to be 100% not your own interest, then that's never going to be the case. Because part of my own interest is creating a just world, and so doing things for and with other people is part of my own self-interest.
Okay. So, but if you're asking the question, what is Sabbath in the magical world? What would you define Sabbath as? Are you just looking for the rest part, or are you looking for the honoring God part, especially since God doesn't really show up in the Harry Potter books? Or are you looking for the helping others part, or, what exactly are you calling Sabbath when you're looking for it in the magical world?
I don't know, because I couldn't really figure out where it would be, right? Like, I think the thing that maybe epitomizes what I feel like, if I had to pick a scene from the Harry Potter books of Sabbath, there's a piece of me that would pick when Harry and Hermione go to Godric's Hollow, and they go when they're in the graveyard and looking at the gravestones and putting a wreath on Harry's parents' gravestone and that sort of thing. Like that. When I was in Argentina for study abroad, I spent a lot of my Sundays at Recoleta Cemetery, and that was my Sabbath, was like not going to church, because it just like, I didn't really find a church that really resonated with me for a while, but to just be among the dead and honoring those sacrifices, which is not honoring God, but there's an honoring a thing bigger than us-ness to it. I don't know, though. Like, that's part of what I'm wondering about when I wonder about what is Sabbath in the magical world, is how do we define Sabbath for the magical world in addition to for us ourselves? But what does it even look like or mean? Or
in some ways, I think that one of the Sabbaths that our modern culture has really embraced is the concept of a honeymoon after you get married. Not so much in terms of honoring God or helping others, but definitely in terms of separating yourself from your everyday life, totally resting, not focusing on work at all. And do Bill and Fleur really get one at all? Like, I think they get a weekend, right? And that's about it. And then suddenly the war is on and stuff is...
And not even then, because it's literally at their reception.
Yeah, so do they get... I mean, were they even planning on one? Do we know?
Maybe they take one at the end.
Yeah.
I actually... So, funnily enough, this actually really connects. My friends are on their honeymoon right now. They got married last year. And they're from and still live in Puerto Rico. And right now, Puerto Rico is up in arms, figuratively, right? because the governor is tied up in, I think, not embezzlement charges, but like money laundering charges in the administration, but also has said some terrible things in chats and stuff. And so I have been seeing pictures of them. I think they're in Peru. But I've seen pictures from them, and this I think really embodies the beautifulness of Sabbath, right? Is they're at Machu Picchu, or they're like in these beautiful places, and some of the pictures that they'll share have just on a piece of paper written Ricky Renuncia, which is like encouraging the governor to, I don't know the English.
Abdicate?
Yeah, like renounce the governor, like step down, whatever.
Yeah.
And it's just this beautiful, like, that is the embodiment of Sabbath. It is both the like rest and the apartness, and also the like still connectedness and the ongoing work for justice. That like sure. Even in the midst of their rest, they're still moving towards justice. Not that I know where that is in the books. Maybe it doesn't happen in wartime, and you have to wait until the war is over, which would suck.
That has happened a lot in history, yeah. Our second reading for this Sunday is Hebrews chapter 12, verses 18 through 29. The author speaks of God's unimaginable power by reminding us of the story of Moses on the mountain. God's power can shake apart any created thing, but the kingdom we are to inherit can never be shaken.
One of the things that was really fascinating to me in this passage was how the author refers to different things. So the author says, you have come to Mount Zion and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, innumerable angels in festal gathering, the assembly of the firstborn who are all enthralled. Right, this whole list of different ways of talking about the reign of God and the holiness in heaven and all of those things. And so then I was thinking about Hogwarts and how the different ways that people think of and refer to Hogwarts, that it's certainly a school of witchcraft and wizardry, but it's also home, and it's also the final place of resistance, the place to take your final stand. It's a sanctuary in many cases for magical creatures, and yeah, and just like all of the different ways that we can think of something that is, at least on the surface, this one thing, but in reality is so much more than that. And then in verse 18, as we begin this, before the author goes into the like magical mysteries of Mount Zion and the city of the living God, there's this acknowledgement of the fear that drives people and the ways that fear has historically driven people, and scary things. And that reminded me of in the first Harry Potter book when Harry's talking to Dumbledore and he like starts to say Voldemort and then corrects himself and says, "I'm sorry, you know who," and then Dumbledore interrupts him and tells him to always use the proper name for things, because fear of a name increases fear of the thing itself. And just the ways that we let fear increase, but when we name things, right, we have a different relationship with that, whether it's naming the good things, the like affirming and positive things, but also naming the things that are bad and evil and harmful.
Yeah, looking at that verse, it reminded me of a sermon that one of my professors in seminary gave once. That sounded a lot like this passage. God loves us, yes, absolutely, but we also tend to overlook or even forget how truly powerful God is, because that makes us uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. We'd rather focus on the warm, fuzzy side of things, but that doesn't mean that the power of God isn't there. Much like how Dumbledore or McGonagall or any truly powerful wizard, with their power in full swing, must have been capable of looking kind of terrifying. You have to imagine. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't mean that they care about their students any less, or that they're less good people. good can be scary too.
Yeah.
Is the idea.
Yeah.
Because power can be intimidating.
Mm-hmm.
And then when we get to verse 28, I think, our human lives, our ordinary muggle lives, are so short in the cosmic sense of things that we often forget just how perishable the world is. I'm kind of surprised that we don't hear more in the books about of Harry Potter, about how the long lifetimes of magical people must interfere with their relationship with the muggle world. It's not like you can keep up with Cousin Nigel's grandkids when they're muggles if there's no way that you can deny that you're 112, right? And you look 80. So, yeah, there's got to be that.
That's interesting. I hadn't really thought about age in that sense. Yeah, that stinks. That would stink to, like...
And I get the feeling that 112 in the wizarding world is more like... our 60. Like, you're elderly, but you're older.
By any means.
I don't want to say elderly, but you're not near the end of your life, necessarily.
Yeah, you can still work. You haven't hit retirement yet. Yeah. Yeah. That's a rough, like, having to let distance grow so that by the time anyone might actually, like...
realize that you shouldn't still be alive.
They don't know you.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's unfortunate. Speaking of fire, which we've been talking about throughout this episode, when we get to verse 29, the author says, "For indeed our God is a consuming fire." So before we had actually had all of our conversations about God's word being fire and God being fire, when I was preparing for this episode, I read this and I was like, is God fiend fire? Which is a thing that we think of as a bad thing, because once you cast it, like, there's no controlling it, and it just consumes everything. And yet there's this, like, beauty in God being this all-consuming fire.
Well, on the one hand, yes. On the other hand, I think fiend fire specifically is called dark magic. So my question would be, is there a corresponding spell in light magic, in not dark magic, that is also a type of fire?
I mean, Hermione's bluebell fire.
Yeah, but that doesn't really do anything other than look pretty. And that certainly isn't God.
I mean, that could be God also.
Is there a truly purifying fire that's not, evil and easily killing people?
Yeah. But also, like, what if the only reason it's called dark magic is because wizards...
It's so extraordinary.
Because it's so extraordinary, because magical people can't control it.
Yeah, and that doesn't necessarily make it evil. We don't really know what the lines between dark magic and not dark magic are. I mean, the unforgivable curses are kind of obvious.
Mm-hmm. But a lot of the other stuff is not obvious and is not even...
Yeah.
labeled.
We don't really get the full explanations.
It's like it's a false binary between dark magic and light magic. Also calling things dark magic and calling things light, and making dark and light good and bad.
Well, yeah, I don't think they really use the term light magic. I think it's just dark magic and not. But yeah.
But still, it, like, evokes these false binaries that we have about good and bad. And
sure.
Yeah, it's like there is no binary. Our gospel reading for this final Sunday of this episode is Luke chapter 13, verses 10 through 17. After healing a woman, Jesus reminds those who criticize him for healing her on the Sabbath that even and especially on the Sabbath, we are called to the work of restoration. So a theme that I noticed in this passage was actually the interruptions in teaching. So right at the beginning of the passage, Jesus is teaching on the Sabbath, and then there's an interruption. And this happens a lot with Jesus, right? Like, he's doing something and then it's interrupted. And so then I was thinking about Lupin is interrupted by Peeves when he's teaching the first Defense Against the Dark Arts class in Harry's third year, when they're on their way to the Boggart in the teacher's lounge. And Lupin, similarly to Jesus, takes that as an opportunity to continue teaching and to continue doing the work. And so he teaches the students wadiwasi, so we don't actually know what wadiwasi does. We don't know if it just like is a thing to get stuff out of the locks and doors, if it's supposed to be used to shoot gum up someone's nose, or just shoot gum in a specific direction. Like, we don't know what it does.
And if anyone was going to know a spell that would shoot gum up someone's nose, I think a marauder would know.
Oh, yeah. It like, makes perfect sense that Remus is the one who knows it, but he doesn't tell us what exactly the spell is doing. Like, right. He doesn't tell us if you have to, like, have the direction in mind, otherwise it'll just get shot wherever, whatever.
Does it only work on gum?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But so then so that's one of the, like, things that's very Jesus-like, right? Where he's interrupted in teaching and uses it as an opportunity to continue.
Yeah.
As opposed to, like, all of Umbridge's interruptions as a teacher are, right, like, she interrupts every single teacher when she's doing their evaluation.
Yeah.
Every single one. To check and see if they remember that they had arranged this time and all that stuff. And for some, it throws them off so terribly. Like, for Hagrid, he's totally thrown off. And it doesn't help that, like, she just talks to him like he can't understand anything she says. And, right, like, there's more to it than just that she's interrupting, but the interruption is the first thing that she can then grab onto to say, oh, you can't do this, and you can't do that, and it just kind of snowballs from there. Versus other teachers like McGonagall, who then are just like, I'm going to ignore you. I'm going to ignore you. And then when you were like, ask me things, I'm going to make you look foolish, because that is what you're doing right now.
Yep.
Because McGonagall is awesome. As we dive into this chapter, I had this vision of verses 10 and 11 being reread, reinterpreted as, now Hermione was brewing a potion in a bathroom. And just then there appeared a woman who was a spirit that had been moaning for 50 years.
I love that image. Yeah.
Thanks.
In verse 14, we get this bit where these people have decided to be offended that she came to be healed on the Sabbath. Mm-hmm. And I have always heard this passage, this bit, as they decided they should be against Jesus, and so they were looking for something to criticize. Mm-hmm. As it happens, we are recording this on the day that it was announced that Boris Johnson will be Britain's new Prime Minister. Mm-hmm. I have to imagine we are going to get used to this feeling very, very soon, if we aren't already. But also, this would, I have to imagine, would also be the tone of his emotional reaction to being told that the magical world was real by whoever took over Fudge's job. I really don't think he'd be for it. That's not something he'd be a fan of.
Wait, I don't know very much about Boris Johnson.
Very much in favor of Brexit, very much against anything that's different from what he's used to.
Oh. So he would be one of the ones who's like, I just want to be mad at Jesus, and I'm going to find anything.
I believe so, yes.
Gotcha.
Okay. We'll see how this works out. Sorry. It should be an interesting time.
I didn't quite understand where you were going with that.
Totally fair. Like, and some of our listeners might not have either. Yeah, I think we're going to get used to that tone a lot more if we haven't already from him. Mm. And then in verse 15, as Jesus says, the Sabbath laws allowed for the feeding and watering of animals. All the laws had, basically almost all the laws had the caveat that they should be followed in general, but if it meant saving someone's life or saving someone from suffering, you could break most of them. Mm-hmm. There are a few that you still stick to, but not a lot.
Like what? I don't remember any that you would still stick to if it was a matter of life and death.
It's like the trolley problem. It's like you can either kill one person or you can allow five people to die, that kind of thing. I believe that there are laws for that sort of thing. But because like sometimes there are no good answers and someone is going to die. But
it's true.
Yeah. But this attitude towards the law very much reminded me how Harry and the trio started seeing the rules of Hogwarts once they realized that they were up against Voldemort, which was a much bigger deal. So... yeah. Sometimes other things matter more.
Yep. There's also actually, and I don't know if it's Erik Erikson's 8 stages of moral development. There's a psychology,
Yes.
moral stages of moral development that also goes with that. When after Jesus is like challenged by folks on healing on the Sabbath, which is like, I don't know, is it healing? Is it casting out demons? You tell me. It said she had a spirit. And then it said she was cured. Does not make sense. That's a total side note.
That's fair.
So then Jesus continues and he says, "And ought not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan bound for 18 long years, be set free from this bondage on the Sabbath day?" And it reminded me of Sirius, who was bound in Azkaban for 13 long years. I think technically it's like 12-ish long years, but...
Right. Close enough.
But...
It's Azkaban, we're not going to...
Right.
Get
and when they're in the Shrieking Shack, he said, "I did by waiting 13 years of it." Because he actually was waiting by then for 13 years, because it was at the end of the 3rd book. But that, yeah, and serious, nobody deserves to be bound for that, right? Like,
no.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us. Catch us next time when we discuss Harry Potter connections to the scripture readings for the 12th through 14th Sundays after Pentecost.
This podcast has been produced by us, Emily Ewing and Kay Roloff. For more information, check us out on Twitter, Facebook, and WordPress, all at HPATCHURCH, or contact us at hpatchurch@gmail.com. This season, we're also putting our episodes on YouTube, where you can listen and see subtitles, so make sure you let your friends know and search for us.
Also, if you like what you've heard, rate us or leave us a review on iTunes, Spotify, Facebook, or wherever you catch your podcasts. If you appreciate what we do, or want to be able to go back and listen to older episodes, or get actual transcripts of the podcasts, consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/hpatchurch. Not only do you get access to special insights or mentions in our episodes, but you'll also be helping us be more accessible and sustainable as a podcast, which is important to us since not everybody has a quick quotes quill.
As the ancient Christians said,
Pax vobiscum.